First-Person Test Prep, and we are back to it in video number 3 of our video series in Game Lab. So far we've learned how to add backgrounds and add objects or characters to our screen. And right now, if you look, we've got an airplane flying in the sky on a background that shows a road leading off into the mountains. So that looks nice. But right now the plane is just sitting there, and at the moment that's not much of a game. If you were to open this up and I said, okay, we're going to play a game, and then you hit run and this was all that was on the screen and you couldn't click on anything, you couldn't move things around, it would be a pretty boring game. So in order to actually turn this into a game, we're going to learn probably one of the most important functions that you'll see in Game Lab. And that, for interacting with your world, is going to be this first function that we see here called draw. So go ahead and bring this into your workspace. And let's just briefly talk about what this function does. So draw is going to run whatever elements that you add inside this function, and it's going to continuously run through those. And it's going to do that every 30 milliseconds, so that as changes happen to the environment, it will update. And it's essentially, think of it like if you were to watch a bunch of images where you have small changes. A lot of times people have seen this in a flip book, where you draw a little image on the edge of a page and then you change it slightly from page to page to page. The way that film works, so not digital, but when you're looking at like old movie films, you have frame by frame images captured, and when you put those images together very quickly, it looks as though you're experiencing smooth motion. And that's what the draw function really does. It allows us to experience smooth motion on our screen. So when you have that draw function, so within that, that's where we're going to add a lot of our changes and interactive components to our game program. So most of the elements that we originally drew outside here, we can actually end up pulling inside the draw function. We don't have to worry about the variables. So that's just where we introduce the idea of a road or a plane. So let's leave those up at the top for right now, where they are. But let's, for right now, we're going to bring in the set animation into the draw function, and we're going to bring draw sprites inside that draw function. And so at the moment, let's see what happens if we run our program. Okay, it looks exactly the same, right? So we have no changes so far because we haven't added anything inside that draw function other than what we originally had. But now we're going to introduce the idea of how we can actually get things to maybe move around the screen. So if we were playing a video game, we would want some way to control our plane. We would want to be able to move it up, down, left, right. And so let's introduce the right way that we can add those motions to our draw function. And this is going to be done through something that we are going to use, which is called a conditional. And so you'll see this here under control, and we're going to use something called if. And let's talk about what an if statement means. So we're going to bring this inside our draw function. An if just means that when something happens, a certain input or certain event takes place, then you're going to have a result, but only if that event happens. And so we're going to introduce the concept of if, and we're also going to introduce a function with our world that's called keydown. And keydown just means that when a particular key is pressed. So let's bring that keydown piece of code into our if statement. So if the key that is pressed is up, what do we want to happen? And for right now, we're going to do up a little bit later, but let's do first left and right. We can actually, it's going to look kind of similar. So first we'll start with left. And so we want something to happen to our plane, right? So if we go over to sprites, let's see what we want to happen to our plane. In this part, if you're new to coding, it's going to look a little weird, and it's totally okay if it does. I'm going to try to re-emphasize and explain it as clearly as possible, and we can go through a few examples. But we're going to change the x coordinate. So if you move your mouse left and right, you can see underneath reset, underneath where it says show grid, you see the change in x as you move left and right with your mouse. And so if we want the left button, that means we want some kind of change of where our plane is located on that x-axis. And so we have our original location is plane.x. That's where it is now. And we actually want that plane.x. So we're going to have plane.x, but we're going to add on to it. And it's, I think, easier to do this if you click on show text, because the blocks make it a little bit harder to navigate around. But we're going to take our existing position, and then we're going to reset it so that if you press left, so your x value, if you press left, you're going to the left, and if you look at your x value, it's getting smaller. So your x value, we're going to subtract, let's try 1, and we can always change that value later on. But let's see what this would look like if I try to run this function. And when you start experimenting with moving your sprites around your game environment, you might notice some really strange things happen the first couple times you do it until you get used to how to reset backgrounds and so forth. So it's okay if it looks weird. It's okay if your object doesn't seem to move the way you want it or doesn't move at all. It's okay if your object all of a sudden starts duplicating itself and you see 4,000 clones of your object creating a streak across the screen. You'll have a few funky things happen, and that's perfectly fine. So let's hit reset and run, and let's see what happens if we press left. Okay, our plane does in fact move to the left, and it looks like it can move all the way off the screen. So, all right, so we have something happening, and it seems to be happening the way we want it. Let's talk about how we can make some adjustments to that. When I pressed left, it moved, but it was kind of slow. If I'm picturing playing a game, I don't know that moving at that pace is going to be enough for me to get out of the way of any obstacles or dodge anything effectively. So if I want my plane to move a little bit faster, I can change this value here where it says plane.x -1. Let's see if we could change that maybe to -5, because that's how many pixels it's moving each time we press left and each time the function draw runs. So now let's check if we run it what that would look like. Okay, my plane moves a little bit faster to the left. So that's what we need to add in order to have our plane move across the screen like that. Now let's see what happens if we didn't have this plane set animation inside of our draw function. A lot of times if we forget to bring everything inside the draw function, we get something that looks a little weird. So if we have the plane outside, we're fine. No change to the plane. Let's see what happens if we take the road set animation outside the draw function. And it looks like we're okay there too. So what you'll notice is for your set animations, it doesn't matter if something is inside or outside the draw function if it's something that you don't need to run consecutively. But the if function, let's see what happens if I were to take this outside the draw function. So let me hit reset and run. I'm pressing left right now and nothing is happening. And the reason why is because this needs to continuously happen every time the button left is pressed in order for the plane to reposition itself. So when you're dealing with your draw functions, it's important to note which elements of that draw function do in fact need to run repeatedly throughout your game. And my recommendation, typically speaking, for most of the game functionalities that you'll deal with, when you introduce your variables and create your sprites, you can leave all of those up top of your code, but most of your animations and most of your conditional statements, so these controls, the if statements, are going to take place within your draw function. So one of the first things to check when you're debugging, if you run into any errors and it seems like your code isn't working the way that you want, try bringing elements that you currently have outside the draw function inside of the draw function and see if that corrects the error. So that's how we can get our plane to move to the left. Now, let's practice having our plane move to the right, and then we'll worry about up and down. So if we're moving our plane to the right, we're still going to use an if statement just like we did. We're still going to use that key down aspect of, that's going to be under our world tab in the toolbox. So bring key down inside that if statement, and now we're going to select right. So what happens if we press to the right? Well, we still want this same thing that we see here to happen, so similarly, but we're going to make one minor change. So here we still have our plane.x equal to plane.x, and before we had -5. So what do you think we're going to do if we want to move to the right? So after this x, hopefully you said +5, and that's absolutely correct. And so here, if we add that in, we can see it's really the same thing, and that's why sometimes working in text is nice, because when you have to do something a lot, instead of, even when you're working in blocks, which can be very fast, but if you have to do an action repeatedly, sometimes it's easier to be able to highlight a large section and copy and paste, and then make the minor changes that you need to within that copied section. So here I'll display it both as blocks and text, and if we reset and run our program, now our plane can move left and right. All right, let's try to work on up and down. And so here, just to show how we can make that quick, we can copy and paste. I'll backspace here just to make everything line up. So now we want to talk about what happens when we have key down up and when we have key down down. And so we talked about how the X was for moving left and right. That's our horizontal axis on this. So if we're trying to move up and down, we're going to want to change our Y value. So instead of sprite.x, we're really going to be using sprite.y. And you could, if you're working in blocks, you could pull those blocks in. But if you have already copied in the text, then here we just want to change these values to Y. Instead of .x, we want .y. And this is something that for new programmers to GameLab can oftentimes be tricky. Let's figure out if we want +5 or -5 for the up or for the down. So most people, when they're first getting introduced to key down up and key down down, when you're trying to move something on your screen up or down, most people end up flip-flopping the positive or the negative. And if you did switch those around, it's perfectly okay. But let's see how this works. So here, if I take my cursor on my screen and I drag it down towards the bottom, we can see the Y value is actually increasing. And that's because Y starts out at 0 at the very top, and it goes up in value as you move down the screen. So a plus value is actually going to move your sprite down the screen, and a minus value is going to be a smaller value of Y is what you would see when you move up the screen. So although it might seem like it's flip-flopped from what you might expect, the up and down do correctly work that way. So here's what our program would look like in blocks. So you can see now we are getting a little bit lengthier of a program, almost at 20 lines of program. So we're starting to see something that really looks like a functioning program for a game. And let's see what happens if we run our program. So now we have our plane that we can move left and right, and then we can move up and down around the screen. All right, so we're starting to have something that resembles a little bit more of something that we could visualize as being a real game. But so far, our game's pretty easy because our plane is moving around the screen, and we currently don't have any objects to worry about. We don't have any obstacles. We can't crash into anything. So let's see if we can maybe introduce some objects or some obstacles into our game in our next lesson. For more, please check out our other videos, and thanks for watching.